We left off last time with a 1935, the purchasing of the new land, the end of that first decade out at the Threefold Farm. And that new land, with its red barn and its White House and all that land up above, that meant that the farming could really expand. Now, Fred and Alice Heckle moved out to the farm in 1933, and Fred was really only 27 years old. He was a journalist in Manhattan, and during these years, so devoted to the farm, and yet he still had to commute into the city for his work in the papers. Now, that red barn meant that now they could really have a dairy. Before long, there were 12 cows in the barn. Fred had to ask for help, so Mr. Jones, Richard Jones, and sometimes his father, and sometimes his son would be out there helping milking the cows. And soon there was a whole milk run going to the various families, the Eatons and the Schleichers and the others. And that actually would continue right up almost until 1970, when the New York Health Department began to clamp down on raw milk. Now, Fred, in those early days, he bought a calf named Daisy. And Daisy came to adore Fred. Fred would describe how Daisy would come up to him and go back on her hind legs and put her hooves up on his shoulders. Well, after some time, he sold Daisy off to another farm. But he went to that farm one day, and Daisy recognized him. Daisy came running up to them, went back on her hind legs again, put the hooves there, and bowled him right over, flat on his back. Now, Fred said that when he came to the farm, he knew very little about farming. He did get some help, though. He had a mule named Toby. And Toby was masterful at plowing just to the perfect end of a furrow and then making a nice, perfect curve and knowing exactly where to start with the next. Now, both Fred and Alice dove into the work of biodynamics. In 1937, they helped start, together with Ralph Courtney, the first biodynamic conference. 100 people showed up there on that Labor Day weekend. And the next year, there were 175. They had to actually move it to a local American Legion Hall. Ehrenfried Pfeiffer was the keynote speaker, as he would be year after year. And based on that, Fred then developed a biodynamic quarterly. That went on for years and years. They also translated the works, particularly of Ehrenfried Pfeiffer. His book, Grow a Garden and Be Self-Sufficient, became quite well known. And so just together, I think the Heckles had a great deal to do with developing this care of the soil, the nurturing of the soil, which they held so carefully until years later, Ehrenfried Pfeiffer would come to join the farm. Now, back in those days still, there were not many people who were there other than the summers, and they all looked forward to those summers. The conferences grew bigger every year. Well-known people still would come from Europe. Hermann Poppelbaum, Hermann von Baravala, George Adams came, and of course Ralph Courtney would speak, and Dr. Linder. Richard Croth, the renowned painter, would do his painting lessons. Gina Palermo would do singing along with Hilda Dighton. Marion Wallace with the Eurythmy. It just grew and grew. And I think made people realize that Threefold had now become so devoted, not just to raising vegetables for the restaurant, but also opening itself to the initiatives of others who would come into this place. But still, there weren't that many people. But that would change in 1938 when the Threefold restaurant in Manhattan finally closed its doors. And with that, Ralph and Charlotte and Louise moved out to the farm. They stayed in cramped little rooms in the main house, but now it was clear that Charlotte Parker wanted a house. This was not going to be a house, however, that Fritz Westhoff did with all of its interesting angles, because she wanted to harken back to her days in New England. So her design was of a Georgian brick, good, solid house. And Carl Schmidt was asked to do the interior. Now, when you walk into it today, you feel right away that you're drawn to the light in the windows. And then you're drawn to the French doors, which you want to open, walk out into the patio, into the walled garden with all of its flowers. But Charlotte loved curves. Everything in the house has curves. Well, there's the winding staircase, which she designed with wrought iron, but also the bookcases, the china cabinet, the kitchen alcove, the moldings. So carefully done by Carl Schmidt. Upstairs, there were the bedrooms, and now each bedroom had its own private bath. The western corner of the house, that was I guess you'd say the nerve center for Threefold. This is where Ralph had his offices. This is where he wrote letters to people about threefolding and wrote newsletters, where he did the finances for Threefold, where he planned those summer conferences. In 1937, Walter Molt, that son of Emil Molt, we've met him already when he was meeting Henry Munches. They had so many remarkable things to say about him when they met first in Vienna. Now, Walter moved with his family from Europe to bring Weleda to America. He brought, it seems like, a boatload of herbs along with him and stuffed them all into a warehouse. People were wondering why he would need so many. But then when World War II came, there was no way to get other supplies, and he was able to produce right through the war. But in 1942, Walter said, I think that our family should live out at the farm. And so we moved there. There was a house across the street from Orchard House that had been built but hadn't been occupied, so that was perfect for them. His little girls, Ursula and Christina, needed a school. The only school there was a one-room schoolhouse. It's the one that's on Schoolhouse Road. But they, with their mother Edith, spent so much time just wandering around through the paths, going up to Indian Rock and telling some of the legends of the area, of the native peoples. They loved to walk through the pastures. Oh, it was marvelous to go to the dairy. They would ice skate on the pond, even built an igloo in the winter for where they could have a meal. I mention all this because this was the first time that children were there in the Threefold farm. Now, Walter Molt stayed with his family there for 14 years before going back to Europe. And it would be a couple decades later before Christina Murphy, she married Finbar Murphy, would come back to the Threefold farm and to take over the operations of Weleda. Now, next to the barn is that white house. That was Esther Eaton's house. Esther had a big porch in the back, and she loved to garden. So people could go up and sit on that porch, as they often did in the afternoons, and she would come and bring them tea, and they would look out over the bushes and the flowers. That continued actually for year after year. Now, in 1941, Henry Munges decided to move out to the farm. His first wife, Maud, had passed away, but he'd remarried, and he and Lisa were looking for a place where they could build their house. But they didn't do it either on the original land or on the new land. Instead, they had a road built up in the land in between it. And at the top of it, Henry, together with George Durist, drew up a plan for a house. Henry's design was really quite delightful. You walk in and you see a sweeping wrought iron staircase going up. You go in, you look over, and you see where all the windows had been. You see these concrete pillars. That was designed by Lisa Munges. There's a hood there, a copper hood over the fireplace, designed by George Durist. And in this house, Henry Munges brought his 3,000 volumes to fill the library. Now, people who have come to it have been very impressed over the years. Cecil Harwood once came to visit, and he said how impressed he was at this design. He says this, The strength and cleanness of the molded forms expressed the same directness of character as did his own upright carriage. For me, the picture of abiding uprightness which Henry Munges gave as he stood at the door of his house bidding me farewell will always remain a symbol and an inspiration. Now, most of you will be very aware that that little house of Henry and Lisa Munges became then the core of what later grew into Hilltop House. Henry lived there for 14 years. He passed away finally in 1954 at the age of 84. And that brings us to the story of this remarkable woman, Nancy Laughlin. Nancy Laughlin was born in 1896 and was raised by a wealthy banker and his wife in Olean, New York. At age 18, she had a terrible shock when she learned that no one knew who her parents were. She had apparently been left in a basket outside of a church, some say on Christmas Eve, and was raised by this family. Now, when they passed away, she inherited a very substantial fortune. At age 32, she was in Paris when a knock came on her door. She opened the door, and there was Germaine Montour. She was a concert pianist, but she had a couple children, and she had to support them. So she was going door to door selling handbags. Now, the two of them got along tremendously well. Before very long, they had moved their households together. They were walking down the street one day when they ran into the American journalist Al Laney, who began to tell them about Rudolf Steiner. Well, they were so enthused that they went straight off the door knock. They always said they got there even before Al did, and absolutely took up anthroposophy in the deepest way. In 1948, when she was 52, she and Germaine moved to the Threefold Farm. They went up on that hill behind the Red Barn and wanted a house right away, so they got a Sears house. Now, in those days, you could order from a Sears catalog. It would all arrive and all be put together in kind of an instant house. It's a very cozy house. If you walk in today, you can still see the sign that it's a Sears constructed house. Well, before long, they added on to it a brick house, and this is where the cranes are today. But that still wasn't enough. Nancy wanted to have a studio where she could do her writing and where Germaine could play the piano. And it turned out that a very well-known architect had landed up in New York. It was Pierre Charot, who built the House of Glass in Paris. Well, when the Nazis came, he had fled with his family. They had very little and couldn't find many good commissions. So she hired him on to come out and build the studio. Well, he set to work. It was part way up, and he decided, no, that wasn't what he wanted. He knocked it down. Again, he built it. He got even further along, and he came and he looked and said, no, this isn't it. Knocked it down again. A third time it was raised even higher, and this time it was knocked down. And at this point, I'm sure Nancy Laughlin was thinking, how expensive is this going to end up being? A fourth time it went up and got knocked down. And finally, after the fifth time, he looked at it and said, well enough. Well, when you walk in today, you immediately turn and experience the 24 feet of glass windows. And you see the redwood paneling and realize this is just a beautiful place to have this kind of studio. It lacked a few, I guess you would say, amenities, little things such as bedrooms, bathroom, kitchen. They had to be added on later on in order for others to be able to come and live there. Now, from the moment that she moved in, Nancy began working often with Charlotte Parker to support various initiatives around Threefold. When that land between the old land and the Munges land and the new land, this land we now know of as Indian Rock Lane, when that came up for sale, by this time, developers were coming out and were looking for every piece of land they could find. And so she immediately purchased it and sold it off to like-minded people such as Walter Light, Howard Mertens, the Lubins, the Van Orts. Most of those houses now are actually part of the fellowship community. Down at the bottom of the hill was built Turtle House. That's an interesting story because a young Swiss mason named Frank Mirich came and built that. And if you look at it today, you can see the turtle on the front wall in concrete. And if you look around, say in the back, you will see a picture of a sun or a plant, even a bear. During the 1950s, Dr. Linder moved out to Threefold. And he was turning 60 and began to talk with other doctors and with other people about how wonderful it would be if somewhere there at Threefold, a place could be found where people could live out their last days in creative community ways. They formed a committee, they called it the Fellowship Committee, and they actually got a nonprofit status for what they were planning to do. Then along came a young man, just 28 years old, Dr. Paul Scharf, moved with his family to take up the practice in New York. And they brought him on board, and they said, well, finally, we have a young person. And they tried to get him interested in the project, but of course he was very busy with his practice and with his family and his new house. His house is a red house just beyond that, at the top of Indian Rock Lane. But the work continued, and the thinking about it continued. And then in 1961, Dr. Scharf's phone rang. It was Nancy Laughlin calling from Arizona. She said, I've just heard that the Munges land is now up for sale, and we can't let developers have it. He says, well, yes, I don't quite know what we can do about it, and it's a very expensive piece of land. She says, I tell you what, I will buy that land if you will commit yourself now to immediately forming a board and get to work in plans for this fellowship community. And so she did. It cost over $1 million in 2026 money. This was a substantial amount of money. And it was there then for a couple of years while things were being planned. Well, the question was, how do we develop this land? When it came time, finally, say 1963, 1964, Nancy Laughlin agreed to sell all of her Texaco shares and put all that money into building the fellowship. That was, again, almost $2.5 million. Walter Leck, the young architect, was set to work to now expand the Henry Munges house so that it could become the hilltop house we know today. And finally, in 1966, it was all complete, and the fellowship community could open. And so we have to ask ourselves, who was this individuality, this Nancy Laughlin? We know that she carried in her a deep loneliness throughout all of her life, and even with all of this work that she did, sharing her fortune for the betterment of humanity and encouraging so many people, that loneliness was there, was pervasive in her. When she passed away in 1973, Paul Scharf gave an address on her life, probing into this. And as he pointed out, that her whole life was a question of, well, who am I really? What is my true being? As she became older, it was harder and harder for her to inhabit this body. He said that it just couldn't contain this grandiose individuality. But the older she got, the more this underlying true longing for the spirit manifested in her. Now, I should say that Lisa Munges then moved down to Hungry Hollow Road and asked Walter Leck to build her a house that's right across from the auditorium. It's that beautiful house when you walk in, and all the wood paneling, the sweeping high ceiling. It was a perfect place, she felt, for eurythmy. Soon other houses came to be built. If you look out beyond the barn, you see the first house you see along that road was built by Mrs. McSorley, Mrs. Sobel, the next one, and you go up a little bit, and that was Sarah Burton's house. Now, down by the main house, by the guest house, there, as you go towards the brook, there are a couple of little houses. One of them was built for Princess Vera Chitwentinsky. She'd been married to a Polish prince, royalty, right here at Threefold. But we have to turn now to that great building, the auditorium that has served for so long the artistic and cultural, spiritual endeavors of this community. In the middle of the 1940s, a group of community members came together and took a whole bunch of clay and began, in the living room of the main house, began to fashion what they could imagine would be the appropriate place for these endeavors. Once they had completed it, Meta Waller-Pyle came from Connecticut in order to do a plasticine model that would become the basis for the auditorium. Meta Waller-Pyle. Now, Meta Waller had been a very close associate of Rudolf Steiner and Marie Steiner, living with them for many years in Berlin and then in Dornach. She had helped support the Congress in Munich in 1907. She had supported all of the mystery dramas, and she performed as Johannes in all those mystery dramas. She was a major supporter of the first Goetheanum. She worked diligently inside it. She helped to paint the small cupola. And then she married the American Scott Pyle and moved over to America, and there came from Connecticut in order now to take those talents that had been so involved in all the endeavors of anthroposophy, and especially the first Goetheanum, and bring it into this new building. It was handed over to the engineer, Daniel Birdsall, to construct a challenging project, given the shapes in the interior and the raised stage. It went then to the master builder of Rockland County, Harry DeBon. For the next 2 years, as this building was going up, Ralph Courtney walked up that hill every day and worked side by side with Mr. DeBon. Ralph would go all over the county scrounging plumbing fixtures, lumber, even the steel beams that hold the major structure up. And together they would talk and go over the plans and build them just to the right specifications. And when that was completed, and 2 years later, they moved to the interior. And this was going to be the work, of course, of Carl Schmidt. That incredibly intricate paneling, that was the design of Ralph Courtney working side by side with Mr. Schmidt. Ralph would come every day and take string and poke in nails, and then it would outline the next day's paneling that went in. This went on not just for months, not even just for years, but actually it would end up taking a full decade of work. It was a marriage made in heaven, but as you know, marriages can be quite raucous, and this one certainly was at times. Ralph would often come up and then maybe even change his mind or want it done slightly differently. People said they could hear occasionally he would go in and their booming voice of Carl Schmidt would be, "And so what is it now?" And yet that work continued. And in the end, no one could complain about the meticulous way that Carl Schmidt devoted himself to that building. Although all the paneling wasn't totally finished, the building was open on August 14 of 1949, in time for a conference, participants to be able to come up the hill for it, community members. Ralph Courtney opened a telegram from the Vorstand congratulating them. Henry Munges gave an address and did recitations. Gina Palermo and Hilda Dighton sang, and music composed by Paul Nordhoff. It was a marvelous day. Now, it also has other rooms in it, the side room devoted so many years, now all these decades, to spiritual study and to conferences. But if we just think of all the Eurythmy performances, the mystery dramas, the other dramas, the lectures that have taken place in that great hall, many people have come and performed music over the years and have pointed out just how remarkable the acoustics are. All the more remarkable because none of the people who were involved in building it had ever studied it in any way. There's a library connected to it. If you walk in, there's a big table, long table, round table, constructed magnificently by the well-known interior designer and builder, Wharton Escherich. It was done at a camp at the Ruth Dewing Studio for Rhythmics camp in the Adirondacks. And if you look carefully on it, it has these designs that are meant to be musical motifs that were carved by the young ladies who were part of this. And at the end of it, they didn't know what to do with it. And so Louise Bybee said, I know the perfect place for it. And that's how it came to be there. Turns out that the building had no plans for heating because, after all, it was there for summer conferences. But Ralph had come across an old boiler system and placed it in the basement just in case, and sure enough, that came to be used. And many of us will remember performances just at the tender moment within a play or during a Eurythmy performance that it would start to fire up and start clanking and clanking away. All of that is gone now, of course. Nancy Laughlin decided that it should really have air conditioning. But when she looked into it, realized that that wasn't going to be practical and be way too expensive. So instead, she was the one who contributed the Steinway piano. There's a little plaque on it that's there dedicated to Germaine Montu. I'd like to return for a moment to Charlotte Parker, who did so many things decade after decade to support people. You will remember that Gladys Barnett went off to do Eurythmy in Dornoch and discovered that she was going to become a farmer instead. But she wrote to her sister back home, her sister Ruth Barnett, who was 19 years old, telling her the wonders of Eurythmy and encouraging her to come over. But Ruth said that she had no money for this. Well, Charlotte heard that, raised the money needed in order to pay for her entire training there in Stuttgart. Ruth Barnett would later marry Hans Pusch, and she and Hans would then move into that house that you remember before, the Dighton Palermo house. And there would be doing, years later, the mystery drama work at Threefold. Charlotte Parker was also deeply involved in the efforts after World War II to support the refugees and others in Europe. So the basement came to be filled over and over again with all manner of clothing and shoes and canned goods and everything. And then it would be whisked off to a ship, sent over to Europe, and they would refill it again. And that went on for a couple of years. She supported, when the school grew, she supported it. But she also supported a man, a very good friend of hers, coming from England, and that is Francis Edmonds. Francis Edmonds had been 2 or 3 decades in Michael Hall's school teaching when he began to take his marvelous abilities to convey anthroposophy, he'd taken them around the world. Charlotte Parker supported him in that. He often came to Threefold. And when it became time to found Emerson College, Charlotte Parker, particularly with one other person, raised the money needed to buy the house that stood there at the core of Emerson College. And who was that other person but Nancy Laughlin? Now, in 1956, the main house as we know it today was largely completed. They added on those large dining rooms and took the form that you see here. That made it possible for you to walk through the front door, go past the living room, and there were no bathrooms there then, to go straight on into the dining area, where you would see a long white table presided over at lunch by, of course, Charlotte Parker and the many others of the founders and those who would come in more recent years. That brings out another side of Charlotte Parker. She was the most gracious woman. She who began that vegetarian restaurant right into her 80s and 90s, she would be up to grab a coffee pot when necessary and to go around and fill people's cups. Um, Sometimes people might complain about a waitress being too slow or something in the kitchen, and she would get up and walk over to a young lady and say, "Well, you're doing a fine job, but here we do it in this way." One day, Margaret Selka came running to her, and she says, "Oh, those freed boys, they're climbing up on your wall. You've got to do something about that over the wall by the orchard house." And she says, "Now, Margaret, you should know better. Uh, when I was a child, a little girl there near Boston, one day I climbed up a telephone pole, and my mother got very, very upset at me. So she came out and she scolded me and came out again and scolded me even more. And finally she came out and said, when your father gets home, he's going to be very, very upset." And I stayed up there the entire day. When my father came home, he looked up into the telephone pole and he began to laugh. And with that, I came down. So Margaret, Charlotte says, boys need to climb. And that brings us back to children. By the late 1940s, there were starting to be more children. Paul and Spina Nordhoff and their two little girls. And they brought them over to the White House and joined with a couple of other children, began at a little kindergarten. But by 1950, it was clear to Ralph Courtney and Charlotte Parker that if could really be a school, which would be more than just a few children from Hungry Hollow Road, that they were going to need someone to come and take it on. Well, that person was Mary Daly. Mary Daly, born in 1904 out near Geneseo, spent most of her early years riding horses. She loved crafts. She loved to make jewelry. She came to Rockland County, where she worked for years with severely disabled children. It became quite known for her work there. There was a school that was trying to get her to be a headmistress, but Charlotte knew about her and used all of her persuasive skills, bringing her to Threefold, showing her around, and convincing her that this would be the place to really try to bring something new in the way of education. And so Mary Daly did. At the crack of dawn, she would be there getting her station wagon going and driving around, picking up children, bringing them back to her little kindergarten, working with them all morning, driving them back home, working on finances, talking to new parents. And this began to take hold. Within 3 years or so, there was actually a first grade. Well, that couldn't continue very long because the health department decided that there weren't enough good toilets in the White House. So they needed another place. Well, there was a young architect named Walter Light, and Ralph Courtney walked up the hill with him on the other side of the road from that White House. And there at the corner, they put down stakes and said this would be the place for a building. That became the kindergarten building built in 1950 and 1956. And so with this new building in place, they could expand their efforts. Mary was joined by kids in McHenry. Elise Stolting came back. She was now Elise Stolting Courtney. She'd married Ralph's brother. They could also have a first grade again. Lucille Clem came and took over that class in 1956. And one reason that the school was able to grow was that Mary Daly had so many contacts. She was so respected around the county. She knew doctors and she knew the people who lived in the various creative communities, of which there were many in Rockland County. The Gate Hill community in Stony Point, where M.C. Richards lived. There was a Skyview Acres out in Pomona, along South Mountain Road. There were many actors and musicians and creative types. The actors, Burgess Meredith and James Daly, each sent a child to the school. But soon it became clear that as they needed more grades, they still needed more buildings. And so where did they go? But they went down to that building by the brook, which is now the Arithmy School, but only half of it was built at the time. the north half. There, and what had been built for Richard Croth as a painting studio, was creatively divided up so that at one point they had as many as 5 little classes in there. Well, some of them were combined perhaps as a second and third, for instance, but they were all squeezed in for the next several years going into the 1960s until in 1965, Walter Leicht was able to then build the lower school as we know it, or at least the first half of it in 65. A couple of years later, he was able to expand it into the full lower school. Mary Daly would, for so many years, be a kind of the guardian angel of that school. After she retired, she went to all of the events, and she drove with her golf cart down to the field that now bears her name to see all of the sporting events, and felt that her presence there very strongly throughout those decades. I turn now to Richard Croth. Richard was born in Germany. They said he gave him his first easel at the age of 8. The family moved to Staten Island. He had an uncle very impressed by his painting and would bring him to all the museums of New York, so that by the time he was a teenager, he was crossing the Staten Island ferry every day and going to study painting. In his 20s, he went to France. He remembered particularly going to the cave of Lascaux and being so amazed at these paintings from, 20,000 years ago that were so expressive of the spirit. He found his way to Dornach and worked with painters there. The lectures on color by Rudolf Steiner became his sort of Bible in his life as when he went back now to Threefold, he plunged into this effort of an Goethean way, coming to know the relationship of light and dark and how it can allow the spirit to emerge as it comes into color. Richard built his house there across the street from the school. You walk into it now, it's been the youth house now, but you walk in and you can only be impressed by what he has done with bringing in the light and all the forms that he poured himself into. He did all the bookcases. He really did every corner of that house. Out behind the house was his studio. And after working there for years, it was a terrible tragedy that the studio burned and took with it much of his really great work. George O'Neill happened to be staying in the house while Richard and his wife were in the city, and he hooked up a hose and was able to save the house itself, but that was really a tragedy. Well, Richard Croth came to be known summer after summer working with the summer school, but then he was invited to go around the country, and he traveled and traveled. At one point, he said within 2 months he had given 70 lectures and workshops. He was invited to major places to speak about his work. He went to the Aspen Institute, and he said that at the conclusion of a lecture, as he was packing up to leave, a man approached him, and it was Arthur Rubinstein. And he says, well, why don't you stay and hear me rehearse for my concert tomorrow? And so he did. Well, next to him was seated a man who had been to his lecture. After, when Richard came home, he got a letter from that man that said he was so impressed by the creativity, by the spirituality that he was bringing to his painting, that he hoped that he would continue these experiments. And it was signed Thornton Wilder. Richard Croth wanted to have a winter program in painting, and Charlotte Parker agreed and said, it's time to build you a real studio. And so she did. But he would never get to start that program because on All Souls Day of 1959, he went to his studio, he put up an easel with a white piece of paper, got it all prepared to paint, took a tube of black paint, and as he squeezed it, he fell to the ground with a massive heart attack and passed away there on that All Souls Day of 1959. received over 600 telegrams and letters coming to his wife, Bettina Croth. And people like Bruno Walter wrote and said that the times that he spent with Richard Croth were very precious to him, that there was the sense that he had in him that this was a person who was a genuine artist, but also a soul filled with a natural human kindness. And Michael Schmidt wrote from Kimberton, "He helped us to see the world as it is. His brush was proof of his sensitive genius. He saw more than we did. His thinking went beyond our thoughts. There was a haunting quality about his work. Under his touch, light began to stream from the hard, heavy objects of the earth. You had to paint in this ascending, aspiring, gravity-redeeming movement, this fair, delicate, feminine movement. It is not far from the mark to say that his work arouses in the one who studies it the stirrings of a different consciousness or a new consciousness." Now that takes us to Ehrenfried Pfeiffer. Ehrenfried Pfeiffer was born on February Day in 1899. He later said it was the very day when the Kali Yuga ended. His parents knew Rudolf Steiner, and they sent him to confirmation class with Friedrich Rittelmeyer. And Rittelmeyer then went to his mother and says, we were then talking about the divine nature of the human being, and little Ehrenfried, he said, I don't see anything divine in human beings. Well, years went by. He went off to the last year of the war where he was an engineer. He was 18, and when it was done, he looked around for something to do and began studying science and engineering again, and then went to a lecture by Carl Unger. And he said that the one thing that struck me, that the line that just jumped out at me, is that in our times, we need a new kind of courage. We need a courage within our thinking. And so he says, I went to my mother and asked about this, and she gave me the philosophy of freedom, which I read, and then I turned to occult science and to theosophy, and decided right away, I'm going to go to Dornach. And as Christmas approached, Ehrenfried Pfeiffer boarded the train and crossed over into Switzerland. No sooner did he get there that they grabbed him and said, oh, we need someone to play the star singer in the shepherd's play. But he had a problem, and that is, he said, I couldn't remember my lines. I finally was so desperate that I wrote them on the star scissors, but when it came time for the performance and I opened them, the lines receded into the distance. But he says there wasn't a real problem because I had a very good prompter who somehow brought me through it, and that was Rudolf Steiner himself. Now, Pfeiffer worked closely with Rudolf Steiner. He helped develop the lighting for the eurythmy. He took up his scientific indications, and in a couple of years, he and Gunther Wachsmuth had been allowed to use the bottom of the glass house for the first anthroposophical laboratory. They experimented in all manners of different directions, but Pfeiffer was particularly interested in the soil. And he asked Rudolf Steiner if it wouldn't be possible to do something that could enhance the fertility of the soil for humanity. And Rudolf Steiner said, well, yes, it could be possible to make certain substances, certain preparations, and he guided him in producing the first preparation, which was a cow horn preparation. So this was the work that he was doing there, and after Rudolf Steiner passed away, other people came to join him. Erika Sabart joined him in the laboratory, Matilda von Frogstein. I mention them because they both ended up coming to the Threefold farm with Dr. Pfeiffer. And they began to work more and more on sensitive crystallization, as it was called, finding a reagent that could be applied to a plant substance, for instance, or to blood, and that out of it would show a crystalline pattern that could give hints as to the needs or the health of the substances. They also discovered that they could only get reasonable results if they approached it in a spirit of prayer and meditation. Now, in 1928, Charlotte Parker and Ralph Courtney went over to Dornoch for the opening of the second Goetheanum. And there they got to know Pfeiffer and got to see his laboratory. And Pfeiffer was eager to show him what was happening in the field, so he piled them into his car and drove off in his typical reckless way. He came over a hill, and there was a bull standing there. He couldn't stop in time, smacked into it, and somehow they survived their adventure. But now, that had led them to invite him there in 1933 for the first annual summer conference. In 1937, Pfeiffer with his young family was invited to come over by the Hahnemann Institute in Philadelphia and to do work there with his sensitive crystallization. And he did that for a year, but then it wasn't renewed. And just at that time, Ulrich Marin, a leading industrialist, oil industrialist, invited him to come and take over his 602-acre farm in Kimberton. So he did. He joined that work and dove into it with all of the preparations and all of the insights into composting, and that lasted for something over a year. But the two of them were like goats, Ulrich Marin and Ehrenfried Pfeiffer, and finally it didn't work. And Pfeiffer was out now in the early 1940s, I think 1941, with his little family, penniless. Peter Escher gathered together $20,000 to help him buy a farm of his own, which he did, some 30 miles west of Threefold, a farm in Chester. And this, with its 200 acres or so, would be the perfect place for him to help to transform the land and then to make it a demonstration farm and a dairy for those who would come out. And that lasted for a couple of years. Kitty McHenry was a teenager in those years, and she would often go out and stay at the farm. And she described, she says, I would hear him get up in the middle of the night. It turns out that Pfeiffer generally was up by 4 a.m. to do his own inner work. And then I would hear the door open and hear him go out. And I went and asked him what he did. He says, well, I was sitting there collecting my thoughts, and this little bird, as often did, would come to my window and would tap on the window. And so I'd get up and put on my robe and go outside and go out into the snow and walk down a steep embankment. And there I would fill the bird feeder, and I'd be able to go back and work undisturbed in my study. Unfortunately, this was not going to last because Pfeiffer contracted tuberculosis, and he could not be around cows. So he went to Pomona, just north of the Threefold Farm, to a medical center there and stayed 2 years. He was so sick that he almost died a couple of times. And we could ask ourselves, how can someone with so much to bring in this life have to face so many obstacles one after the other? But he said that, in those moments near death, I had experiences of the Christ that were so powerful that it led me to study esoteric history. And that time there in that center opened up a whole other aspect of human life. Pfeiffer would then move to Threefold, where Margaret Selke would look after him, where he'd be able to put a laboratory up in the auditorium. You probably know that there's this tower next to the auditorium, and that was where the telescope was put in. Carl Schleicher knew how to do this well. And there they would have all kinds of gears and levers that would allow it to track stars across the sky and funnel that light down onto seeds, for instance, in order to study its effect. Unfortunately, Carl Schleicher passed away before it could be finished, and although I remember winding up those steps and looking with amazement at the moons of Jupiter or to Saturn, that it moved so quickly you couldn't really make use of it. So now Pfeiffer went on to give hundreds of lectures simply in threefold on all manners of history and of philosophy and of Christianity and, of course, on farming and on soil, and then traveled all across the country and became just one of the best known and most sought after speakers that there has been here. His effort was to show people how through inner work we can approach this work with substances, approach this work of the farm in such a way that we can take these etheric forces that are generated and give them back to the cosmos, that they may then be returned to this earth to help humanity in the coming days when technology may have some very even catastrophic results. Pfeiffer was finally able to get a job as a professor for a few years in a little university, which helped him. He traveled to places. He went with Sally Burns out to Oakland, where they worked with the city to develop a recycling plant that would turn the garbage into usable compost. And in fact, they had some success with it, but ultimately it was hard to spread, and the city ended that project. But he was continually working to develop new sides, new approaches to the work of soil and to the human spirit here on this earth. Now, the 1950s must have been a remarkable time to be walking the paths of Threefold. Henry Munges coming down the hill, Fred and Alice Heckel, Walter Moulds, who might have been there, of course, Aaron Fried Pfeiffer, Ralph Courtney, Charlotte Parker, Dr. Linder, who moved out in the 1950s and took that house right next to Green Meadow Waldorf School. And I can just imagine the kinds of conversations that would have happened and the thoughts about the upcoming summer conferences or the various other conferences during the year. And with that, I would like to reflect back on Ralph Courtney and his efforts beginning in 1923 with founding the Threefold Commonwealth Group, and the work with the restaurant, the work in the city, bringing it out to the farm, and always imagining that the farm would manifest many of these principles that were so important to him. Principles such as people working together in associations, whether they're in the economic life, to be able to support one another's initiatives on that side, and then the other side in the cultural realm and the educational realm, that people out of free initiative can develop them and then raise their children. And he had really experienced in the 1920s when people were so much more involved in their clubs and their groups and their lodges, their churches, their educational organizations, and much more involved in their local government, where so much was happening, that this could become the basis so that that realm in the middle, his rights realm, and the government wouldn't feel the need to do more than to support the cultural realm, support the economic realm, and not become deeply involved in it. Or on the other hand, the economic realm, for instance, becoming too deeply involved there in the realm of the rights. There was real hope for that in the 1920s. And the feeling that the more that people work together in this mutual way, in their local way, the more they could support what might unfold as a general threefolding of society. He became concerned, at least as I see it by reading the newsletters up through the years, that by the 1960s, much had been fading out in terms of this work together in groups. Fewer involvements of people side by side together to build things in their local communities. More of a turning towards the government in Washington, more of a reliance on what that government was doing. He was very concerned about this, to the point that he had on all of his newsletters, it now said about threefolding, it called it a movement for decentralization. And I think he hoped that Threefold would be a place that would manifest as people come together and to work in their groups to help develop it, to look towards economic initiatives, to support all of the various educational initiatives, the cultural initiatives that were coming, that it could somehow manifest how these three parts of society could work and live together harmoniously. So that was Ralph Courtney's work. Now, as I said, there were so many of these people who were thinking together and working together in the 1950s. And later in that year, in 1958, Paul Scharf came and joined them. Of course, we know that over time, that generation was passing on. Henry Monges passed away in 1954. Richard Croth in 1959. In 1961, the end of November, on the 24th of November, Aaron Free Pfeiffer suffered a massive heart attack, and with his wife at his bedside, as well as Dr. Scharf. 6 days later, he passed away on the 30th of November. Dr. Linder, who had done so much in the medical work in this country, passed away in 1964. And then in 1965, Ralph Courtney passed on. And that's going to bring us towards the end of the story, but I do have to bring in one other significant individual whose life was cut short. Barbara Michaela Leicht was the beloved daughter of Walter and Eva Leicht. In February of 1956, this 4-year-old girl, so vivacious, so interested in everything in life, so loving of nature, so loving of her family. She had an older sister. She would say things to her mother, such as, what would it be like to go off with the angels and come back in another body? On February 16th of that year, 1956, Barbara Michaela Leicht, when she was going to bed, asked her mother if she would keep the window open so she could float off to heaven. In the middle of the night, she woke up and her parents came, and she reached out and held their heads over hers as almost a kind of a, pictured almost like a trinity of her looking into their eyes. Later that day, she and her sister would go down to the Red Barn, and they were standing on the lower side of it when a car came around the corner, driven by a woman from Hempstead, New York. And as she saw them, it was a snowy day, it was a slippery road, she hit the brake and the car drifted uncontrollably towards the barn and crushed Barbara to the side of the wall, and there Barbara Michaela Leicht passed away. Now, many people experienced in the course of those next years, 1956, that same year was the year her father built the first building that he built there, the many that would follow. That was a kindergarten building, and she had said when she would go by that little school, although she wasn't attending yet, she would say, well, that's my school. People felt the presence of her all through those years, as if the children coming from this other world and coming to this world, finding their way here and through the doors of the school, that she was somehow present there in the spiritual atmosphere of the school. And that others who came at the end of their life and spent their last years at the fellowship could feel that as they approached the threshold back to their true spiritual home, that little Barbara Michaela Leicht was there. Now, I arrived 50 years ago, and there in the later 1970s, I could walk in and see that long table with so many people still there. Just think of all those who lived on into their far later years. Charlotte Parker, of course, Constance, Ling, Gladys Barnett. It was Gladys Hahn now, and she came back and lived her last years in the fellowship. Sarah Burton, Charlotte Driggs, we could go on and on. I remember walking in there and seeing them. Dickie Vibber, who, by the way, was Matilda von Frogstein. She came over and she married Holland Vibber, and they built that stone house, the first one as you pass orchard house, that stone house with beautiful garden. That was the work of Dickie and Howland Vibber. So I would see them all there. And when I arrived, some people said, well, there are a lot of older people who maybe are holding on to the past in this community. And I have to say that I never felt that. They realized that a generation was passing, and partially had passed, and that a torch had to be handed to a new generation, and they were eager to see that happen. They were nothing but supportive of the many of us young people who descended in this place in the late 70s and the 1980s. And I remember so strongly this feeling that for all these years they had carried this place. They had built their summer conferences. They had invited people to come to have their own vine and fig tree. Had encouraged so many people to explore their spiritual life, their artistic life, their community life in so many different ways. I have such powerful memories of this marvelous group of people who came together, some of them first in 1921, and then built that restaurant and came out to this farm and dove into the process of working with the soil, working with the cultural life, the community life, and then giving way now to the new institutions because they were coming. The school expanding with that lower school, and then the gymnasium, which was funded, by the way, by Nancy Laughlin, and then the other buildings, and the fellowship, and all that's arisen out of that, and the Autospect school, and the Eurythmy school, and the other artistic trainings, and that auditorium, and what it has meant over these years. And I hope this gives you a feeling of the kinds of impulses that were there to make it possible for it to be the flourishing place that it is today. Thank you.